I still remember the sting of cold air hitting my face that morning, the kind that wakes you up before your mind has fully caught up. I stepped out onto my deck with a coffee mug in hand, expecting the usual quiet start to my day. Instead, I froze. 3 people stood in my backyard, inside my fenced private yard, like they had every right to be there. And at the center of them was Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, her blonde bob and oversized sunglasses unmistakable even from a distance. For a solid second, I thought maybe I was still half asleep, hallucinating. But the tapping sound of her clipboard against her palm snapped everything into harsh clarity. My first instinct was disbelief. My second was anger, sharp and immediate. "What are you doing in my yard?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. Karen didn't even flinch. She didn't look startled or apologetic or even mildly uncomfortable. She turned to me slowly, almost theatrically, like I was the one interrupting her. She lifted her chin and said, "Routine inspection. We have authority to enter when we suspect a violation." A violation? I stared at her, then at the 2 board members measuring my fence line like they were surveying a crime scene. The smell of damp cedar from the fence I'd built just a month earlier mixed with the metallic scent of cold morning air. The rustling grass under their shoes irritated me in a way I can't explain. It was the sound of strangers trampling over something private, something mine. "You can't just walk into my backyard without notice," I said, stepping down the deck stairs. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, each step bringing me closer to the absurdity unfolding in front of me. Karen didn't bother turning her body toward me. She kept scribbling on her clipboard, tapping her pen like a judge preparing a sentence. "We received a complaint about an unapproved modification," she said flatly. "We're verifying." "That fence was approved," I shot back. "I have the paperwork." Karen finally looked at me, her sunglasses reflecting my own frustrated expression. "If it was approved," she said, "it wasn't approved by me." Something felt off in her tone. Something smug. Something rehearsed. And the casual dismissal in her voice, like the truth didn't matter as long as she said otherwise, ignited something deeper in me. I had dealt with difficult people before, but never someone who treated private property like an extension of her ego. The morning chill crawled down my spine as anger simmered under my skin. I told her to leave firmly, but she only smirked, not even hiding it. "We'll leave when we're finished." No apology, no acknowledgement of the trespass, nothing but cold authority. That was my first glimpse of the kind of power Karen believed she had over everyone in this neighborhood. Then I noticed it, clutched under her clipboard, half hidden, was a folded document with my name printed across the top. My approval form. The same one I had safely filed inside my home office. The same one she had just denied existed. Seeing it in her hand stopped me cold. My voice caught in my throat, and that was the moment I realized Karen wasn't just trespassing. She had come prepared. She had come for something far bigger than my fence. My eyes locked onto the paper in her hand as a single thought hit me. How did she get that document in the first place? Karen accusing me of a violation I knew I had never committed hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just the lie itself, it was the confidence behind it, the way she delivered it like a verdict that couldn't be appealed. For a moment, I stood frozen in my own backyard, staring at the folded document she tried to hide under her clipboard. There was no mistaking it. I recognized that paper instantly. It was my fence approval form, the one I had personally submitted weeks earlier, the one I had watched the architectural committee sign. The same document I kept in a labeled folder inside my office. And yet somehow, impossibly, Karen had it in her hand. That moment yanked me straight out of my shock and into something else entirely. Determination. If she wanted to play this game, I was going to prove exactly who was lying. I walked straight back into my house, adrenaline buzzing through my arms. I pulled open the drawer in my office desk and retrieved the folder marked Fence Approval. The paper inside was crisp, clean, and stamped with the HOA approval seal. Multiple signatures lined the bottom, including Karen's, in thick looping cursive. There was no ambiguity, no error, no missing detail. It was official, it was legal, and it was mine. When I stepped back outside, several neighbors had gathered on their lawns, drawn out by the commotion. I could feel their eyes on me, curious, sympathetic, and uneasy. They watched in a kind of collective silence, their bodies tense like they already knew this fight wasn't just about a fence. Karen's reputation had clearly preceded her. I approached her, holding the paperwork in my hand. "Here," I said, keeping my voice steady. "This is the approval form, with your signature on it. You can stop pretending now." She took the page from me, looked at it for barely a second, and then shrugged. "This isn't my signature," she said loudly, making sure the neighbors heard. "And even if it were, it appears to be fraudulent. I never approved this." The audacity of that statement almost knocked the air out of my lungs. I leaned closer. "So you're telling me someone forged your signature on an HOA approval document?" She didn't answer that. Instead, she turned to the board members behind her and pointed at the fence like she was presenting evidence in a trial. They nodded along obediently, their expressions stiff and rehearsed. The tension in the air thickened, spreading like humidity. One of my neighbors, Mark, shifted, uncomfortably, and muttered, "Here we go again," under his breath. I realized then that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. But I wasn't going to fold the way Karen expected. I knew the law, at least enough to stand my ground. Homeowners are legally entitled to retain and rely on approved documentation. Once an HOA approves a modification, that approval is binding unless revoked with proper notice and cause. Karen wasn't just bending the rules, she was breaking them outright. I looked her straight in the eye. "I'm not backing down. You know this is approved, and I'm going to prove you're lying." Karen smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile meant for peace. It was the tight, mean kind that people use when they believe they've already won. Without another word, she turned and walked toward her car. One of the board members placed a yellow slip of paper on my porch railing before following her. I didn't notice it until they were gone. When I picked it up, my stomach dropped. It was a brand new HOA violation notice. A fine, issued that same morning. And stamped across the top in bold red letters were the words, "Immediate action required." The moment I received that brand new fine, something inside me hardened. If Karen wanted to pretend my approved fence had suddenly become an unapproved crime scene, then I needed to go deeper than arguing in my backyard. So the next morning, I walked straight to the HOA office and formally demanded access to the architectural and approval files for my property. Under state law and our own bylaws, homeowners have the right to review any documentation related to their home. It was a simple request, but the reaction it triggered was anything but simple. The woman at the front desk froze with her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if I had asked for nuclear launch codes. Her smile flickered, then vanished completely. She mumbled something about the board president needing to authorize the request. That alone was suspicious. These records didn't require presidential blessing. They were supposed to be freely accessible to homeowners. When I pressed, she excused herself and hurried down the hall, her footsteps clicking faster than they needed to. Minutes later, two board members I had seen in my backyard the day before appeared, wearing nervous smiles that didn't match their eyes. One of them, Tom, held a clipboard like a shield against bad news. "We're doing some reorganizing of old files," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Might take a few days before everything is accessible." I crossed my arms. "I'm not leaving until I see my documents." The air grew thick. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, flickering like they were uncomfortable too. Tom exchanged a look with the other board member, a tight-eyed woman named Denise. They whispered to each other, voices shaky, before reluctantly guiding me to the storage room. The moment we stepped inside, a wave of stale dust hit my throat. The room was cluttered with old boxes, metal cabinets, and stacks of unfiled papers leaning like unstable towers ready to collapse. I ran my fingers across the old cabinet drawers, feeling grit gather on my skin. The nervous energy in the room was impossible to ignore. Denise's hand shook slightly as she reached for a key. She unlocked a drawer labeled Architectural Approvals, 2017 present. My folder should have been there, alphabetically organized like all the others. But when she slid the drawer open and rifled through the files, her movements grew more frantic. She pulled out stacks, shoved them aside, checked behind binders, then checked again as if the folder might magically appear on the second attempt. But it wasn't there. "My file is missing," I said quietly, though my voice vibrated with anger. Tom cleared his throat, the sound thin and unconvincing. "Sometimes documents get misfiled. We'll locate it." I didn't believe him. Not for 1 second. I pulled open the next drawer myself. As I scanned other homeowners' approval forms, I noticed inconsistencies almost immediately. Approval timestamps typed over older ones. Signatures darker in some areas, lighter in others, like they had been digitally altered or reprinted. Some pages even had smudged ink, as if they had been rushed through a printer. It wasn't just negligence. It was tampering. I straightened up slowly, the weight of what I was seeing settling onto my chest. "How many other files have been altered?" Neither board member answered. Their silence was louder than any admission. I stepped out of the storage room into the hallway, anger pulsing beneath my skin like a second heartbeat. As I walked toward the exit, a neighbor who had been lingering near the doorway leaned closer. His voice was barely more than a breath. "You're not the only one she's done this to." Before I could respond, he added, "And some of them paid the price." Hearing that quiet warning in the hallway stayed with me long after I left the HOA office. "You're not the only one she's done this to." Those words echoed through my mind the entire walk home, each repetition pushing me closer to a realization I didn't want to accept. Whatever Karen was hiding, it wasn't just about my fence. It was bigger, wider, systematic, and if I wanted the truth, I needed to hear it directly from the people who had been living under her shadow for years. So that evening, I went door to door. Most neighbors seemed startled when I knocked, like they were afraid answering their door might land them another fine. But once I explained what I had found, missing documents, altered approvals, a fabricated violation, they opened up. And once they started talking, they didn't stop. One neighbor, Linda, told me Karen fined her for a dead bush that wasn't dead at all. Karen refused to inspect it, refused photos, and demanded payment anyway. Another neighbor, Javier, received a $300 fine for having his trash cans visible for 5 minutes past pickup time, even though 3 other houses had left theirs out all day with no punishment. A young couple down the street whispered that Karen threatened to place a lien on their home over a misfiled pool permit that wasn't even their mistake. They paid her out of fear. As the stories piled up, frustration simmered through the neighborhood like unseen pressure building under a lid. People talked in low, trembling voices, constantly glancing around as if Karen herself might appear behind them. I could feel the emotional weight in every house I entered. Years of intimidation, resentment, exhaustion. It wasn't just that Karen abused her authority. It was that she had conditioned the entire community to feel powerless. One particular moment stuck with me. An older man named Frank, gripping the edge of his chair, his knuckles white, as he said, "She fined me twice for the same violation. I paid the first one. I refused the second. She told me if I didn't cooperate, she'd send collections after me." His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from a kind of tiredness that only comes from being pushed too far. It all clicked in my mind with disturbing clarity. The missing files, the altered timestamps, the fabricated approval dispute. None of it was random. Karen didn't enforce rules. She enforced control. Selective enforcement, choosing who to punish and who to protect, was not only unethical, it was illegal for HOAs. The bylaws were meant to ensure fairness, consistency, and transparency, but Karen twisted them into weapons, using them to intimidate anyone who dared to question her authority. By the time I finished my rounds, the sun had slipped behind the roofs, casting long shadows across the street. My frustration had transformed into something sharper, a promise to expose everything she had done. I couldn't stay silent now. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for all of us. As I made my way home, a neighbor I barely recognized, tall, quiet, always kept to himself, stepped out of his garage and waved me over. His expression was tense, his jaw tight. He didn't bother with small talk. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder. "You need to hear this," he said, pressing it into my palm. "It's from one of their closed-door meetings. You won't believe what they say when they think no one's listening." And as he walked away, he added, "This is where everything starts to make sense, and where things get dangerous." I didn't even make it through my front door before I pressed play on the recorder the neighbor handed me. The audio crackled for a moment, like old radio static, before voices came into focus. And the first one I recognized, instantly, unmistakably, was Karen's. Hearing her voice while standing alone in my living room made my chest tighten. I braced myself, but nothing prepared me for what came next. "We need to deal with him," she said. No hesitation. No context needed. I knew she was talking about me. "If he won't listen, we escalate. Higher fines, faster deadlines. Make it clear he can't ignore the board." My stomach twisted. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't bureaucracy. This was strategy. A planned, deliberate targeting. A second voice chimed in. Tom, the board member who stalled me at the office. He sounded uneasy, but complicit. "But he has paperwork," he said quietly. "If he proves it in a hearing..." Karen cut him off sharply. "He won't get that far. We control the schedule. We control the review. If we say the paperwork doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. End of discussion." I felt heat rising in my face, anger climbing like a wave I couldn't stop. They weren't just bending rules. They were rewriting them in real time, using their positions to manipulate outcomes. And my neighbors' names weren't spared either. One after another, I heard them discussed with casual cruelty. "Find the couple on Maple Court again," Karen said. "They'll pay. They always do." "Flag Frank for non-compliance," another board member suggested. "He won't fight it." I recognized every name, every story. Everything I had just collected door to door now had an audio counterpart. It was like peeling back the wallpaper on a pristine wall, only to find rot, mold, and decay underneath. This recorder wasn't just evidence. It was a map of the corruption I had suspected, but never imagined ran this deep. Then Karen's voice returned, colder than before. "He thinks he can challenge me over that fence? No. I'll make an example out of him. Once we're done, no one else will question my decisions again." I paused the recording, needing a second to breathe. A sharp metallic taste filled my mouth, the kind that comes from adrenaline and fear mixing together. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't overreaction. It was a coordinated attack, planned, rehearsed, and carried out with full board participation. I replayed sections just to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting anything, but every time, the meaning was crystal clear. They were weaponizing fines. They were tampering with documents. They were manipulating schedules and hearings, and they were relying on fear to keep the neighborhood quiet. What stunned me most wasn't their behavior. It was how normal it sounded to them, as if this was just another Tuesday evening meeting, as if ruining people's lives was part of their organizational duties. When the recording neared the end, I heard something that made me sit down abruptly, the hairs on my arms rising. Karen said, "Schedule a vote. Not a public one, a board-only session. We need authorization to move forward with enforcement against him." A vote. About me. My throat tightened as the board murmured in agreement, their voices fading into static as the file ended. They weren't just planning more fines. They were formalizing their attack. They were preparing to make me an example. And then I realized something even worse. The secret board vote wasn't planned for later. It was scheduled for tonight. Karen's illegal entry into my yard, the moment that initially stunned me into silence, suddenly became my strongest weapon. Everything she had done, every lie, every denial, every fabricated violation, pointed back to that first moment when she crossed my fence line without warning. Now that I had heard the recording of her plotting, I finally understood why she was so desperate to claim inspection authority. If I could prove she'd trespassed, her entire case against me would collapse. And she knew it. So I spent the next morning gathering every piece of evidence I could. I walked the perimeter of my yard with my phone, taking photos from every angle. The footprints in the still soft soil, the measurements they had taped to my fence, the indentation in the grass where Karen had stood tapping her clipboard. I checked my outdoor camera footage, recorded the timestamps, and backed everything up twice. The digital record was clear. She had entered without knocking, without announcing herself, and without any form of permission. And she brought her board members with her. That alone was enough to make my pulse race. But instead of fear swallowing me like it had the day before, something else rose inside me. Determination. The kind that builds slowly, forming a steady pressure in the chest. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't exaggerating. I was being targeted, and now I had the means to prove it. I spent the afternoon speaking to the neighbors who had seen the incident. Some had watched from their porches, others through blinds, but they all remembered what they saw. Karen entering my yard unannounced. Several agreed to give written statements. A few even offered to sign affidavits if necessary. Their support steadied me, grounding me in a way that made the fear shrink just enough for clarity to take its place. Legally, an HOA cannot enter private, fenced property without notice or explicit permission unless the bylaws include a clause allowing emergency access. And ours did not. Even the state statute was clear. Homeowners have the right to quiet enjoyment of their property, free from unauthorized intrusion, regardless of HOA affiliation. Karen hadn't just bent the rules. She shattered them. With all the evidence laid out on my dining table, photos, statements, timestamps, the approval papers she denied, the damning recording of her own voice, I wrote a formal complaint. It was the most focused I had felt in days. I listed every incident chronologically, attached supporting documentation, and drafted a demand letter requiring the board to cease all enforcement actions against me immediately. I made sure to cite the HOA bylaws and state codes word for word. If Karen wanted a battle, she was about to get one she couldn't manipulate. By the time I finished, evening had settled over the neighborhood. Streetlights clicked on one by one, washing the sidewalk in pale yellow. I stood at my window for a moment, letting myself breathe. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had control, or at least a fighting chance at reclaiming it. But peace never lasts long when you're dealing with people who fear losing power. Just after 9, headlights swept across my driveway. A car door slammed, then another. I stepped out onto my porch, and there they were. Karen, flanked by 2 board members, walking toward my house with purpose. Her voice cut through the night. "We need to talk, now." And as they stepped into the glow of my porch light, I realized none of them were holding clipboards this time. They had something far more serious in mind. I woke up the next morning to the sharp, papery sound of something fluttering against my front door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but when I opened the door, I felt my stomach drop. 3 envelopes were taped across the wood, each stamped with the HOA logo and marked in bold letters. Violation notice. Seeing them lined up like warnings sent a cold dread straight through my chest. The air still smelled like dew, but the scent did nothing to soften the heaviness settling inside me. My hands shook as I pulled the envelopes down. The paper smelled harsh and chemical, like it had just come off a cheap printer. Fresh intimidation delivered overnight. I opened the first envelope. A fine for lawn overgrowth, even though my lawn had been mowed 2 days earlier. The second envelope accused me of having an unauthorized structure, accompanied by a blurry photograph of my backyard shed, the same shed that existed long before I even bought the house. The third notice was the most infuriating. Failure to comply with HOA inspection procedures, referencing the very trespass Karen committed. Each allegation was fabricated, each fine strategically designed to bury me under financial pressure. I stepped outside and saw curtains shifting in a few windows along the street. Neighbors were watching. A couple of them stepped onto their porches, hesitating as if unsure whether approaching me might put them at risk too. The tension in the neighborhood was thick and quiet, like everyone feared speaking too loudly would summon Karen herself. Linda crossed her arms and whispered, "She's escalating. She's done this before." Javier nodded from across his driveway, adding, "She pushes until people break. Then she wins." Their words made something tighten in my throat. This wasn't just about my fence anymore. This was about punishment. Public punishment meant to send a message. Fear dug its claws in deeper than I wanted to admit. Fines add up fast. HOA penalties, if left unpaid, can spiral into liens, attorney fees, and even foreclosure in extreme situations. The possibility of financial damage loomed over me like a dark cloud ready to burst. I wasn't wealthy. I didn't have thousands lying around to fight manufactured violations. Karen knew exactly what she was doing. But fear wasn't the only emotion filling me. Determination pushed against it, steady and persistent. I knew enough about HOA law by now to understand that fines cannot be issued without due process. The board must provide written notice, allow for a hearing, give the homeowner an opportunity to dispute the claim, and document the violation with clear evidence. Karen ignored every single requirement. Her notices were nothing more than threats printed on cheap paper. I gathered the envelopes and brought them inside, placing them next to my growing pile of evidence. The house felt unusually quiet, as if holding its breath with me. I sat down at the dining table where my formal complaint still lay, the ink barely dry. Karen's retaliation confirmed exactly why I needed to continue pushing back. She wasn't just bending rules, she was weaponizing them. As I scanned the new notices one more time, something moved at the edge of my porch. When I stepped outside, no one was there. But on top of the welcome mat sat a single folded piece of paper with no name, no signature. Inside was one short sentence, written in small, hurried handwriting. "Check the HOA bank statements." And in that moment, I realized this fight was about to get much bigger and much darker than anything I'd uncovered so far. When I exposed Karen's behavior to the neighborhood, everything changed. People who had been silent for years suddenly found their voices again. It didn't happen through an official meeting or some grand announcement. It started with something far smaller. A text message chain I initiated after receiving that anonymous note about the HOA bank statements. By noon, at least a dozen neighbors responded, each one hinting that they too had stories they'd never dared to share openly. The shift was subtle at first, but I could feel it. The community's fear was cracking. By late afternoon, we gathered in Linda's backyard, chosen because her high fence offered a sense of safety from Karen's prying eyes. It wasn't a formal event, no chairs lined up, no podium, but it felt more important than any HOA meeting I'd attended. People stood close together, their voices low, their expressions anxious but determined. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel alone. I started by showing them everything I had collected. The fabricated fines, the missing documents, the changes in timestamps, and then the recording. When Karen's voice echoed through Linda's yard, a ripple of anger moved through the crowd. No one interrupted, no one whispered, they just listened, absorbing every word. It was as if hearing her plotting aloud made every rumor suddenly real. Then the stories came. One by one, neighbors spoke up. Frank stepped forward first. His voice shook as he described the double fines Karen issued him, how she threatened collections if he didn't pay immediately. A young mother shared how Karen warned her that her kids' bicycles violated visual harmony rules, even though no such rule existed in the bylaws. Another neighbor, Mark, revealed that Karen had once tried to block him from attending a board meeting by falsely claiming he hadn't paid his dues. As each story unfolded, an invisible thread wove its way between us. We weren't isolated victims anymore. We were witnesses. Witnesses to a pattern of abuse stretching years back. Hearing everyone speak, something inside me settled. The fear I had carried for days began shifting into something stronger. Solidarity. Momentum built quickly. People weren't just angry. They were ready to act. Someone suggested filing a collective complaint. Someone else proposed removing the entire board. But the idea that gained the most traction was the demand for a full financial audit. If Karen was manipulating violations and paperwork, the bank statements could reveal just how far her control truly went. The anonymous note suddenly felt like a warning and a guide at the same time. "This isn't just mismanagement," Linda said firmly. "This is corruption, and it's time we expose it." Heads nodded around her. A sense of unity filled the yard, replacing the tension with purpose. It felt like watching a community wake up from a long sleep, stretching limbs that had forgotten how to stand strong. And for the first time, the possibility of real change didn't feel distant. It felt inevitable. Just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, painting the sky in fading streaks of orange, a quiet voice spoke from the back of the group. It was Daniel, the accountant who lived 2 houses down. He always kept to himself, soft-spoken, observant, the type who never said more than necessary. He stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "I can review the HOA's financials," he said. "All of them. If Karen's been hiding something, I'll find it." The group fell silent, stunned, and in that moment, I realized the battle was no longer just mine. The community had chosen to fight beside me, and Daniel had just offered the key to uncovering the truth Karen feared most. The numbers Daniel uncovered made everyone gasp. I'll never forget the look on his face the evening he gathered us in his living room. Stacks of printed statements spread across the coffee table. He wasn't dramatic by nature, quiet, steady, meticulous, but the tremor in his voice as he said, "You all need to see this," told me we were about to cross a line we couldn't come back from. We crowded around him, the room smelling faintly of coffee and old paper. The first page showed a series of withdrawals labeled as administrative expenses, but Daniel pointed out they were made late at night, on weekends, and in amounts that didn't match any known HOA budget category. Thousands of dollars a month were being siphoned out, leaving unexplained gaps in the ledger. I felt my heart thud harder with each line my eyes scanned. He flipped to the next page, and the situation grew even worse. Multiple charges from high-end stores, boutiques, luxury home decor shops, restaurants well outside our area. Some transactions were as small as $40, others as large as several hundred, but all were paid using the HOA account. "This isn't just sloppy bookkeeping," Daniel said quietly. "This is misuse of funds, possibly embezzlement." The more he showed us, the tighter the room seemed to become. Heat pressed in from every direction. My palms grew damp as he circled transactions connected to Karen's personal spending habits. Several neighbors recognized the names of stores she bragged about shopping at. A sickening realization hit me. While Karen fined people for imaginary violations, she was using their money to fund her lifestyle. Community outrage grew like a storm gathering speed. Linda covered her mouth with her hand. Mark cursed under his breath. Someone else paced near the fireplace, shaking their head in disbelief. Every person in that room had paid dues faithfully, trusting the HOA to manage the neighborhood responsibly. Instead, they had been financing Karen's private shopping sprees. The legal implications weren't hard to understand either. HOAs must maintain accurate, transparent financial records available for member inspection. Every expenditure must be documented, categorized, and justified. Missing receipts, vague labels, and personal purchases violate state regulations and can trigger civil and even criminal penalties. The fact that Daniel found months, possibly years of irregularities meant Karen hadn't just crossed a line. She had erased it. As the shock settled, the outrage sharpened. What Karen did to me, trespassing, tampering with documents, manufacturing violations, was infuriating. But what she had done to the community as a whole? That lit a fire in people I had never seen before. "This has to be brought forward," someone said. "We can't let her stay in power," another added. "We need an emergency meeting," Linda said firmly. "Tonight." Daniel nodded, gathering the papers. "The board must be confronted with this, and the members deserve to know the truth." The rising energy in the room was unmistakable. What started as a scattered group of frustrated homeowners had become a unified front. We weren't whispering anymore. We weren't hiding. We were preparing for a confrontation that could change everything. As we left Daniel's house, neighbors walked together down the street, voices low but determined. Words spread rapidly, house to house, porch to porch. By nightfall, enough signatures had been collected to force an emergency HOA meeting under the bylaws. The board could no longer ignore us. They were legally required to face the community. When I arrived at the clubhouse, people were already filling the seats. Murmurs swept through the room like an electrical current. And then I saw her, Karen, standing near the podium, her posture stiff, her face pale and tight. For the first time since this began, she looked terrified, and I knew, as the room fell silent, that the reckoning she had avoided for years was finally about to begin. The moment I stepped into the emergency meeting, I felt every eye turn toward me. The room buzzed with a restless energy, tension hanging in the air like static before a lightning strike. Karen stood near the front, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. But when I walked to the podium with my folder of evidence, the room fell completely silent, and in that silence, I began. "I want to show you what your HOA president did," I said, projecting my voice across the room. I laid the first photograph on the table. Karen in my backyard, uninvited, stepping across the boundary of my fence. Gasps broke out immediately. The next photo showed her board members with measuring tape in hand, all taken from my outdoor camera footage. "This was trespass," I continued, "and she lied about having authority to enter my property." Karen shot up from her chair. "That is taken out of context," she snapped. "We had reason to believe—" I cut her off by placing the approval document on the table. "You mean this approval? The one you claimed didn't exist? The one with your signature on it?" A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd. Karen's jaw clenched and she shook her head, but the evidence lay between us like a bright warning flare she could no longer extinguish. Neighbors stepped forward with their testimonies. One after another, they described fines for non-existent violations, threats made behind closed doors, and intimidation meant to silence them. The more they spoke, the smaller Karen's presence seemed. Pressure built around her like tightening walls. She tried to fight back. "These people are exaggerating," she said, her voice growing shrill. "They're disgruntled homeowners looking to stir trouble. They don't understand the responsibilities of running an HOA." But it was too late. Her tone, once commanding, now sounded desperate. She attempted to shift blame onto the board. She claimed misunderstandings, clerical errors, miscommunication, anything to divert the avalanche heading her way. None of it worked. Every attempt to manipulate the room only made her guilt stand out sharper. Then Daniel stepped up with the audit report tucked under his arm. He spoke calmly, clearly, presenting the financial discrepancies. Unexplained withdrawals, personal purchases, falsified descriptions. As he detailed transaction after transaction, the community's outrage ignited fully. Murmurs swelled into angry voices. People demanded answers. They wanted accountability. Karen's face turned pale. She looked around for support, but the board members were already backing away, literally taking steps away from her chair. Tom cleared his throat and said, "We didn't know about the financials. Karen handled most of the expenditures." Denise added quietly, "She told us the records were in order." For the first time, I saw fear in Karen's eyes. She had built her power on the board's obedience, but now that power was collapsing beneath her feet. The board members, sensing the inevitable, sought to salvage themselves by separating from her completely. The community was done being intimidated, done being silent. I leaned forward, meeting Karen's stare directly. "This isn't misunderstanding," I said. "This is abuse of power. This is fraud. This is trespass. And this is the moment we put an end to it." The room erupted into applause, anger, and determination all mixed into one rising voice. Karen tried to speak again, but her words were drowned out. For once, she wasn't in control. She was cornered. finally held accountable for everything she had done. Then Linda stepped to the microphone, her voice steady and authoritative. "Under the bylaws," she announced, "the community has the right to call for a vote to remove the board in its entirety." The room hushed instantly, and as the ballot sheets were distributed, one thought echoed in my mind. Tonight, everything was about to change forever. The board was removed in a single decisive vote, and Karen's downfall began almost immediately. Watching her step away from the podium, face drained of color, hands trembling despite her forced attempt at composure, felt like witnessing the collapse of something that had been looming over us for far too long. But the true shock came when the newly appointed interim panel began sorting through the records Daniel uncovered. Within hours, they confirmed what we all feared. The HOA's finances weren't just mismanaged, they were in shambles. The numbers didn't lie. Years of unauthorized spending, missing receipts, and falsified entries had drained the reserves. What should have been a stable, well-funded community organization now stood on the edge of insolvency. The discovery triggered mandatory reporting requirements, and the HOA was forced into either bankruptcy proceedings or full financial restructuring under state oversight. The announcement shattered whatever thin illusion of stability remained, and Karen couldn't hide anymore. Legal notices started arriving at her door. Restitution demands, civil suits, investigations into financial misconduct. She had weaponized power for years, but now the law was turning all that weight back onto her. Neighbors whispered that she had hired an attorney, though no one saw her outside much after that final meeting. The woman who once patrolled the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff now stayed behind closed blinds, avoiding the community she had tormented. For me, the shift was surreal. After weeks of fear, frustration, and constant confrontation, I could finally breathe. The tension that had wrapped itself around my chest slowly loosened. The nights felt quieter. The mornings felt lighter. Standing in my backyard, the same place she had trespassed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The fence she tried to weaponize against me now felt like a symbol of everything she failed to destroy. Justice doesn't always arrive in dramatic moments. Sometimes it arrives gradually, as each consequence lands exactly where it belongs. The community, once fractured by fear, was rebuilding its trust. Neighbors waved again. People walked the streets without glancing over their shoulders. The air itself felt different, less heavy, less policed, more ours. The new interim board worked quickly. They halted all outstanding fines, repealed several of Karen's fabricated enforcement policies, and began drafting measures to prevent any single individual from holding too much control again. Transparency meetings were scheduled. Financial records were opened. For the first time in years, the HOA began operating the way it was meant to, with accountability, fairness, and cooperation. But even as things improved, part of me still felt the lingering effects of the battle. I had spent weeks fighting against an institution that should have protected me, and though I was proud of what we accomplished, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unfinished remained beneath the surface. That feeling grew stronger one quiet afternoon when I walked to my mailbox and found a certified envelope addressed to me from the new board. The weight of it felt heavier than its size, like whatever was inside carried the next step in this long, exhausting journey. I turned it over in my hands, listening to the faint slide of paper inside. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I stood on my porch, staring at the envelope, sensing that this wasn't just paperwork. It was the beginning of something else, something I hadn't anticipated. And as I finally tore the seal open, one thought pulsed through my mind. What could possibly be left for me after everything we'd already uncovered? The letter revealed the final outcome of everything I fought for. As I unfolded the pages, my eyes scanned lines that felt almost unreal. The new board, now operating under temporary state supervision, formally apologized for the harassment, the fabricated violations, and the illegal actions committed by Karen and the former board members. Every fine issued against me was voided. The trespass incident was acknowledged as a breach of homeowner rights, And perhaps most satisfying of all, the investigation into Karen's misuse of funds had progressed to the point of recommending full restitution and further legal review. Reading it, I felt a warmth rise in my chest, relief mixed with something deeper. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't preparing for a fight. I wasn't storing evidence, gathering statements, or anticipating the next blow. I was simply standing on my porch, holding a letter that represented closure, a full, undeniable acknowledgement that what happened to me was wrong and that I had been right to stand against it. Peace didn't return overnight, but it returned steadily. Neighbors began rebuilding their confidence in one another. Community events started again. Kids played along sidewalks without parents worrying that some obscure rule would be twisted against them. The neighborhood felt lighter, freer, almost unfamiliar without the constant shadow of Karen's authority looming over it. For me, the biggest change came the first morning I stepped into my backyard and felt nothing but calm. The fence, once the spark of all this chaos, stood exactly where it always had, solid and unthreatening. I brushed my hand along the wood and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, the absence of fear. That alone made every sleepless night, every tense conversation, and every confrontation worth it. Standing up for myself wasn't easy. There were moments when I doubted everything. Moments when the fines piled up, when neighbors whispered, when Karen stared me down with that cold, calculated authority. But fighting for my rights meant fighting for everyone's rights. And seeing the community find its voice again proved something I'll never forget. Power only wins when people stay silent. The closing paragraphs of the letter outlined new protections being added to the bylaws, transparency requirements for all future financial decisions, and stricter oversight of board activities. It was the kind of change that should have existed from the start, but sometimes change requires a spark, and sometimes that spark begins with the smallest act of resistance. As I folded the letter and set it on my kitchen table, I realized how far the journey had taken me. I didn't just win against Karen, I helped expose a system that had been bending under her control for far too long. That victory didn't belong to just me. It belonged to everyone she had intimidated, silenced, or targeted. It belonged to the community, finally reclaiming its voice. Before I end this story, I want to ask you something. If you were, in my position, faced with an HOA president abusing her power and threatening your home, what would you have done? Would you have fought back, stayed quiet, or taken another path entirely? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to hear your experiences and what you would have done differently. And as for me, life continued forward. The days became peaceful again, routines returned to normal, and laughter replaced tension on our street. But every now and then, when I walk past the old HOA office or look at the fence that started it all, a quiet reminder settles in the back of my mind. HOA corruption doesn't just appear. It grows quietly in the spaces where no one is watching. And sometimes, the only thing that stops it is someone willing to pull the roots into the light.